The police apprehended an old man sitting on a park bench, unaware that before them stood a war hero, a general who had defended the country they had sworn to protect. His hunched figure seemed to them like just another homeless black man disturbing the peace, and their rough hands were already reaching for the handcuffs. But when the truth of his identity was revealed, they realized they had made a mistake that would change their lives forever. What happened next would shock even the most jaded. But let's start from the very beginning. James Williams, an elderly black man, was returning home after his morning walk. His steps were unhurried as he enjoyed the peace of the small park in the city center. He wore an old army jacket, a reminder of his days serving his country. However, this peaceful moment was interrupted when a patrol car pulled up near the bench where he had sat down to rest. Two police officers got out of the car. Sergeant Tom Howard, a man in his 40s with a tired look, was the first to notice James. Young Officer Jason Miller, fresh out of the academy, followed behind him. Howard instantly felt disdain for the man who, in his mind, didn't belong in the respectable neighborhood. Seeing the black man in simple clothes, he assumed he was either a vagrant or someone up to no good. "Hey, old man, what are you doing here?" Howard shouted as he approached. His voice was full of aggression, leaving no room for a friendly tone. "You have no right to be here. This is a decent park, not for people like you." James looked at the officers calmly, maintaining his dignity. He had faced bias many times before, but he hadn't expected it to be so open in his own neighborhood. "I'm just resting after a walk," he answered quietly. But his response only irritated Howard further. To him, this man looked like a lawbreaker, not worthy of respect. "You got any ID? Are you even legally allowed to be here?" Howard asked sarcastically, barely trying to hide his suspicions. James pulled his ID out of his pocket and handed it to the officer. Howard grabbed it carelessly, glanced at it briefly, then handed it back, dismissing James's words. Miller stood nearby, silently watching his partner's actions. He felt that something was wrong, but he didn't dare intervene. The tension was growing, yet Howard continued to press James. "Listen, you'd better get out of here before you get yourself into trouble." A small crowd of passers-by started gathering nearby, noticing the aggressive behavior of the police. Someone had already taken out a phone to record the incident, but Howard paid no attention. James remained calm despite the increasing pressure from Howard. Around them, more people began stopping, watching with interest and confusion. One young man nearby had already started recording the incident, sensing that things could end badly. But Howard, caught up in his sense of authority, noticed none of this. "Did you hear me? Get out of here before it gets worse," Howard persisted, not giving James a chance to explain himself properly. Keeping his composure, James replied, "I'm not breaking any laws, officer. I'm just resting in the park like anyone else." But these words only enraged Howard more. He had already decided that this man didn't deserve to be treated respectfully. Miller, standing next to him, could feel the situation spiraling out of control. He watched as his partner crossed the line, yet he hesitated to step in. Inside, he wrestled with whether to follow his sergeant's lead or stop the misconduct. His gaze shifted from Howard to James and then to the crowd, which was steadily growing. "Sergeant," Miller began quietly, but his voice was drowned out by Howard's shout. "I said you better leave, or I'll have to arrest you for disturbing the peace." With that, Howard stepped forward and grabbed James by the arm. The crowd around them stirred noticeably. Someone shouted, "He's not doing anything!" But Howard wasn't listening, his attention fully focused on James. He yanked at James's arm, ready to put the cuffs on, but James stood firm. At that moment, he realized it was time to speak up. "Listen," James began, raising a hand to de-escalate the situation. "I'm a retired U.S. Army general. I served this country for more than 30 years. Are you really going to arrest me for sitting in the park?" His words hung in the air like a clap of thunder. The crowd froze, and Howard paused, hearing the unexpected statement. His hand stopped midway to the cuffs. He clearly hadn't expected such a revelation. Miller, too, was stunned. He knew the situation had changed, but now it was too late. The crowd was becoming more indignant. Some were shouting, "This is madness!" and "How can you treat a man like this?" What kind of general? Howard muttered in disbelief, still gripping James's arm, but his voice was now lacking the confidence it once had. A moment of hesitation hung in the air. Howard, still gripping James's arm, paused, his confidence shaken. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. A general? He muttered, not letting go. However, James' gaze remained steady and confident, without a trace of fear or worry. The crowd, having heard this revelation, began whispering, and the phones recording the incident were now actively capturing every moment. People realized they were witnessing something important. Howard felt the tension but didn't want to admit his mistake. He tried to maintain control over the situation. "I don't care who you are," Howard growled, tightening his grip on James's arm. "You're still disturbing the peace, and I'm doing my job." His voice was full of frustration, but a hint of doubt crept into it. The crowd was watching his every move with increasing discontent. At this point, young Officer Miller, who had remained silent, stepped forward. He didn't know what to do either, but he sensed that things had gone too far. "Sergeant," he began cautiously, trying not to escalate the situation further. "Maybe we should check his story. If he really is a general, then—" Howard sharply turned to Miller. "Are you questioning my actions?" he roared. But his voice no longer carried the same authority. He realized that if James's story were true, the situation might spiral out of his control. "Fine, check him if you want, but I'm in charge here," Howard grumbled, still holding on to James. Miller pulled out his phone and began looking up James' information in the database. Meanwhile, James stood calmly, his hands in front of him, to avoid provoking the officers. Behind them, the crowd was growing more vocal, many now loudly expressing their discontent. A few minutes later, Miller looked up from his phone, his face pale. "Sergeant, he's telling the truth. James Williams, retired U.S. Army general," Miller said, his voice trembling. The air grew thick with tension. Howard froze. He realized that the situation had slipped out of his hands and that there was no way to retreat. "So what?" he began, but his voice lacked the certainty it had before. "That doesn't give him the right to disturb the peace." But this was just a desperate attempt to cling to his authority. The crowd was now chanting in support of James. Some shouted, "You're arresting a war hero." Others added, "Let him go." Suddenly, a black SUV pushed through the crowd and stopped at the curb. A man in a military uniform quickly stepped out and headed toward the officers. It was Captain Marcus Jackson, a longtime friend and colleague of James, who had learned about the incident through social media. He understood that time was running out and that he had to intervene before the conflict escalated further. Approaching them, Captain Jackson introduced himself and looked sternly at Howard. "Sergeant, this man is a United States Army general. I demand you cease this unlawful conduct and release him immediately." Captain Jackson's words struck like a thunderbolt. Sergeant Howard, caught off guard, finally let go of James's arm, though his face still showed a desire to maintain control. He glanced over at Miller, who nodded in confirmation of the captain's words. Howard realized there was no way out. The crowd began applauding, supporting James and his defenders. "General or not, the law is the same for everyone," Howard grumbled, trying to hold on to some semblance of authority. But his words no longer carried any weight. The crowd was already chanting, "Let him go!" and "This is unfair." The situation Howard had tried to control had completely unraveled. Captain Jackson stepped forward, his expression firm and resolute. "This man has not broken any laws," he said loudly, so everyone could hear. "You have no right to detain him. I demand that you stop this nonsense immediately." Howard took a step back, feeling his position crumble. He knew that the video of the incident had already spread across social media, and any further action on his part would only make things worse. He slowly nodded to Miller, signaling him to remove the cuffs from James. Nervously, Miller approached James and freed him. The crowd erupted in applause once more, many shouting words of support for General Williams and Captain Jackson. Howard felt the contemptuous stares on him, but his pride kept him from fully backing down. He quickly scanned the crowd, then turned to James and said, I'm sorry for how this turned out. This was a misunderstanding. James looked at Howard with a serious expression. A misunderstanding? He said calmly. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a system, and it works against people like me every day. Silence fell over the crowd again. James's words hung in the air, and even those who had merely been watching felt the depth of his statement. Howard lowered his head, unable to find words to justify himself. He realized that his authority had crumbled, not only here but in the eyes of his colleagues and the public. I served this country all my life, James continued, now addressing the crowd. I defended the rights of all citizens. And now that I'm retired, I can't even sit on a park bench like a regular person. The crowd cheered his words, with someone shouting, "Thank you for your service!" Howard, feeling his control slip away, stepped back, leaving Miller standing next to James and Captain Jackson. Miller, embarrassed and clearly troubled by what had happened, stepped forward. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, looking directly at James. "I should have stopped this earlier. I didn't want to be part of this." James nodded, his expression understanding. "I get it, son," he replied. "What matters isn't what you've done until now, but what you'll do next." These simple words carried profound meaning for Miller, who nodded in response, feeling the growing weight of shame for his inaction. Soon, the video of the incident went viral. Social media exploded with discussions about the injustice and racial discrimination James had faced. The police department launched an internal investigation, and Howard was temporarily suspended. Miller, having realized his mistakes, publicly apologized, vowing to change his approach to his job. James and Captain Jackson decided to speak on television, sharing their story and calling for reforms in the law enforcement system. In his address, James emphasized the importance of fighting systemic racism and injustice that Black citizens face every day. "This isn't just a single incident," James said in closing. "It's part of a system, and we need to change it." Sergeant Howard, after an internal investigation, was dismissed for abuse of power, and his actions became a symbol of everything wrong with the modern law enforcement system. The story concluded with James, having faced these trials, remaining strong and steadfast. He demonstrated that even in the most difficult situations, one can find the strength to fight against injustice,